All right, so last week we discussed the three different types of assessment, the diagnostic, which is the pretest, the formative, which we said had formal and informal assessments, and those are doing when you're teaching the things that you're realizing that you're using for data to see if your students are getting what you're saying, and then summative. We talked about summative being like unit test and the GMAS, end of the course test. Those are things where we know that we can't make many adjustments afterwards to actually change the student learning. Those are pretty much the ones that we say, okay, this is what the students have learned at a certain amount of time. Now we're going to talk about the forms of assessment and essentially how do we view assessment as does how much does it show us in the knowledge of our students. So of course, when we talk about assessment, there are different types here: selected response, written response, performance assessment, and then personal communication. Of course, right now, as we look at this, selected response and written response are probably the two major assessments that we do in class. And when we do selected response, of course, think about the good thing that it is. I mean, of course, it is, um, you know, it is something that is fast. We can quickly measure it, but however, it is not objective. It is subjective because it's human made. And because of that, sometimes we think the data is objective, like this is exactly what the kids know. But the truth is, there's so much subjection in the way that we ask the questions, and it only gives so much response into the answering. Of course, we have a written response. Written response is great because might give us a better chance of seeing what the students actually know. But of course, there's some major problems with written response. And one being, it takes a long time to grade those and look at those and give feedback to those. And of course, that is a problem. Number two is if your student is not a great writer, they might not still be able to tell you what they know. So that becomes a problem because how in the world, if they can't write, then they can't really be assessed. And so we have some problems with written response, of course. Next is performance task. And performance task is kind of really honestly the task that we do every day. Think about the way that you are assessed. You're assessed by the way you perform. And so as we look at our students and we want to make them college career ready, we want them to actually get pushed into a task in which they would do something that would resemble the real world example. And that's why that assessment is so much more valuable in this kind of atmosphere. So that's something we need to think about. How do we make more performance tasks, and how do we give that kind of criteria? Because even though we have to give select a response and response, eventually what we want is our students to somehow feel like they've done something. Remember, we said learning is an experience, and performance assessments give that kind of experience. And of course, in performance tasks, you can give that student response. This is pretty much true with the Flipgrid that I gave you. So Flipgrid is a great kind of piece because it does give that actual response, personal communication piece. And sometimes we don't have time to listen to everyone communicate. So it at least creates a database of that kind of response. So we have four different types of kind of assessment choices. You do a select response, rent response, performance task, and then you have your personal communication with your students. I want you to right now, and you'll see the thing come up on your the thing is I want you to kind of feel which one do you feel like you are constantly doing, and what is the drawbacks to constantly doing that type of assessment. So I want you to think about which ones are you doing, and what is the drawbacks for doing that kind of assessment. So next we talk about assessment and grading. So I want you to think assessment and grading are two different things, really. A lot of times we think they are the same, but they really are two different things. And it is because of this component of grading that we actually kind of get grading and assessment mixed together. And of course, when we look at this, we can see that grading is kind of this thing that we use to essentially create a score for our students. But assessing is really figuring out what exactly do our students know? So grading is essentially trying to evaluate by number of a student, while assessing is trying to evaluate actual student learning. And those things can be in juxtaposition. Here's a video, and just watch this video of exactly some different things that are going on here.
Students get half credit for an assignment they didn't even turn in. A former St. Lucie County teacher doesn't think so.
That's why she posted this on Facebook, a whiteboard goodbye to her 8th graders while taking a stance, she says, against the school's no zero policy. News Channel 5's Amy Littman spoke exclusively with that teacher tonight. Amy.
Well, right here I have a page up from the Student and Parent Handbook from Westgate K-8 school here in Port St. Lucie, and you can see a grading rubric right here, and then it says no zeros. Lowest possible grade is 50%, and this is the policy that a former teacher wants changed.
Years of teaching, I have so much stuff.
Motivation, inspiration. That's what Diane Tirado strives to provide her students as a longtime teacher.
Teaching is a calling for me.
So she thought the same when she started teaching 8th grade history at Westgate in Port St. Lucie last month.
I had so much fun decorating my room.
But then she assigned this Explore Notebook project.
This is what I gave weeks for.
When several students didn't turn it in, Tirado found out about what she says is the school's no zero policy, reflected here in the Student and Parent Handbook.
But what if they don't turn anything in? Well, we give them a 50. I go, oh, no, we don't.
We spoke to a parent at the school about what he thinks.
You don't know what's going on at home, and what you see is front level. Because if my son blatantly chooses not to do it, he knows he's got an issue. Ain't that right?
Tirado was terminated on September 14th, but there's no cause mentioned in the letter from the principal since she was still in her probationary period. On her last day, she wrote this message to her students on her whiteboard before she left and sent out a picture of it through a class app. Her students responded.
You are right about not giving people 50s.
And then she posted it on Facebook. It's now been shared more than 400 times.
A grade in Ms. Tirado's class is earned.
Tirado hopes this time she motivates policy change.
I'm so upset. We have a nation of kids that are expecting to get paid and live a life just for showing up. And it's not real.
And I did reach out to the principal here at Westgate to comment on this no zero policy, but she deferred comment to the school district, who told me that despite the red lettering that you see here, that there is no district-wide or individual school policy that prohibits teachers from giving students zeros for work that they don't turn in. Reporting live in Port St. Lucie, Amy Littman, WPTV, News Channel 5.
So right now, after we've watched that, what I want us to do is I want us to think about, do we agree with that teacher or disagree with that teacher? Go ahead and put in a response now for that. All right, so now we talk about content complexity. And really, when we talk about making a question in assessment or thinking of a question, we have to understand that there is all these things that we need to think about that students have to go through to answer a question. One, they have to have prior knowledge and experience. Two, they have to have processing and concepts of skill. So even if they've experienced it, if they don't have the skills to actually say what they've said or be able to demonstrate what they know, then they won't be able to tell you what they've experienced. It's just like a baby. Baby has experienced things, but because they don't have the language skills, they can't tell you what they've experienced. So we got to make sure that they have the experience, they have the skills, then they understand the material. There's numbers of parts to the material. So a lot of times we think assessments as one question, which is one skill. But as we will see with DOK, there actually is several different thinking methods that have to go on for you to actually know what that question is about. And then we have the application of content structure. And so as we get into the DOK levels, we're going to see this happening. So here we have a survey for enacted curriculum, ELA cognitive structure. And so when we think about our DOK levels, we have to think about the idea of what exactly are we asking? Are we asking them to recall, demonstrate, analyze, and investigate, evaluate, and generate? As you see, each one of these kind of verbs, things get a little bit more involved. And so what are we doing? Are we asking for recall? We want to ask ourselves, How involved are our questioning of our cognitive skills are we actually giving? Here's the math, right? We can reproduce something so we can just do the problem over, or can we actually say this one skill, like addition, kind of does it's repeated addition that makes multiplication. Can we do a reflection skill in which we can take a bunch of unfamiliar concepts, money, decimal, fractions, and put them all together and understand that they work together as a whole? That takes a broader knowledge of how the world works. And so when we ask a student to duplicate a question over and over again, remember, we're only asking for reproduction questions. How do we build up that rigor? And a lot of this comes from the depth of knowledge. So I want us to understand this first and foremost. Level 1 depth of knowledge is not a bad thing. Okay. A lot of times we have to recall things. That's what we have to do. A lot of times our experience is really the beginning of recalling. But as we build our rigor, we want to think about how that works. Okay, so why do we look at depth of knowledge questions or DOK questions? Well, we have to understand that there is a different kind of verb that we're wanting to do. And that honestly, when we assess students, they have to build upon certain things to get to a high level of depth of knowledge. And so when you went back to your forms of assessment and you thought about which forms of assessment do you actually use and how much you use, think about the depth of knowledge that we're actually using in those assessments when we do this. So let's look at this next right here. So which of these conclusions is best supported information from the passage? So if I gave a question like this, the question is, what kind of depth of knowledge am I actually asking? Is this a high level depth of knowledge or a low level depth of knowledge? So this totally, and because it has multiple choice, does it make it high level or does it make it low level or level 1 to level 4? This is a good question because, of course, when we see multiple choice, a lot of people will say, well, this is a level 1. Maybe people might say level 2. But we got to know what we can ask different types of questions using different depths of knowledge. It just depends upon the thought process that the student has to go through to actually be able to understand the question. So is this student actually going through a process in which they have to make their own conclusion to answer this question? If they do, that's a higher level than a level 1, even though it's a multiple choice. So let's look at what exactly are the thought processes that the student has to do. So there are more than just ELA and math, but we're just going to look at ELA and math right now. You can find online the science and social studies depth of knowledge to let you know. Okay. So ELA though, and of course they're pretty much basically the same. And that is the idea of recall and then slowly getting to performance task or something that is. So let's look at this ELA one, and I'll show it to you right here. You can pause it and then look at it. So really ELA 1 is essentially vocabulary, identifying things and being able to put a vocabulary word with it. But level 2 is essentially being able to take something and summarizing that from the main point. So level 1, I would say, is identifying vocabulary. Level 2 is essentially identifying main idea or patterns. When we get to level 3 is when we infer about the main idea. So it's essentially an author's purpose, summarizing text, critically analyze the literature. So when we go back to that multiple choice question in the last slide, of course, because they were having us base a conclusion, that would be probably more level 3 because that person has to go through what they think the author's purpose for. Level 4 is when the student actually takes it, analyze, and they actually do something with it. I want to say this about level 4. A lot of people get level 4 wrong. You really can't do a level 4 question or assessment in one day. It normally takes a week, 2 weeks, because a level 4 is a performance task in which someone has to go through the painstaking reality of actually creating something or doing something. And we can't normally do that in 3 minutes. So a lot of times on GMAS or end of course tests, people say this is a level 4 test. The truth of it is, the Norman Rad, who created this, he definitely said you cannot create a level 4 multiple choice question on an end of the year test. It is a performance task. Let's look at math here. So again, just recalling procedures is DOK1, just like recalling vocabulary in ELA. In math, recalling just the how to do something is level 1. DOK2 is actually when we take something and we compare it, we classify it, we put it, or it's a 2-step procedure. So now I've got to do one thing and then I've got to do another thing to answer that question. DOK3 is when we get into those problem solving ideas. We're citing evidence. In geometry, you have to give proofs. This is when we get in that DOK3 level. And of course, DOK4 is taking a multi-level problem with data and actually creating some type of equation that goes with that. And again, you can't do that in a class period. So DOK4, it might be a long-term project. It might be figuring something out that works in the real world. So we just got to understand that when we look at DOK4, it's something that it takes time, okay? And it normally will take other subjects to actually be able to understand that. The thing that we want to understand is if I have a DOK1 question, I can get my students to answer a DOK1 question by either showing them procedure or helping them identify the word. And so that's a one-step process. It's a process of recalling. When I get to DOK2, though, I need to start saying, my kids have to walk through maybe 2 or 3 steps. They might have to do 2 types of equation problem solving, or they might have to look at different vocabulary, look for main ideas, and then look for details to answer that question. Well, that's 3 skills that they have to do to solve a DOK2 question. Well, you're going to say to me, well, that's a lot. But when we look at the standards, when they looked at the Common Core standards of ELA, look how many Common Core standards are really just DOK1 standards. A lot of our standards right here are just one-step standards. They're just recalling things. So we really shouldn't freak out when we think we might be teaching to a low rigor, but we really are teaching to the standard. If the standard is just saying to recall or identify a word, that's a DOK1, and it's okay. DOK2 is really just figuring out how to put 2 problem or 3 problem solvings together, and DOK3 is essentially trying to find the total theme or total summary. The truth is that a lot of our standards are DOK2 and DOK3. And a lot of them, when we thought that most of our standards taught to DOK4, truth is not. And we have the least amount is DOK4. Most of our standards are DOK1, 2, and 3. So let's look at this right here, okay? Which of these words means the same as the word of gauge? Because we're trying to identify the word, what would you say it would be? DOK1, 2, 3, or 4? It's DOK1. Yeah. A car owner registered this when the highway sign warned detour will be the odometer reading of the car when it reaches the detour. How many steps would a student have to go to solve that question? Well, because they had to go through 2 steps, then it becomes what? A DOK2. This one person, he memorized the numbers of pi 3.14, and he kept winning, and he remembered 15,000. Seems like a lot, doesn't it? But the truth of it is, it's really just a DOK1 question because he's just recalling that question. This person has to take this graphic novel and they have to compare it with the actual play that the DOK level, this person has to take the graphic novel and they have to compare it with this play that it came from, the Romeo and Juliet. Because they have to compare and contrast and they have to figure out the motifs of both, it then becomes a DOK3. And of course, this grading math alongside of it, you can definitely take it. I'll let you think about that one and then put your answer in. What kind of question do you think that is? So pause this for a second, and then I want you to try to figure it out, and then tell me what DOK level do you think this mathematics question is. So here we have a question also, which models could represent the solution of the problem below? Because they have to go through the different ways that you would actually solve this problem, then of course it's not a DOK1 because it's not just recalling the problem. Because there's different things they have to look at, it's multiple processes of solving a problem. It could definitely be a DOK2. So remember that when you're asking a question, you're thinking about how many different ways does the student have to look at it to make it that kind of problem. And that's something we have to think about, okay? So select the choice that best completes the following sentence. When the amount of light surface of the moon that is visible from Earth is increasing, the moon is, and of course, it sounds like that's very complicated, but the truth of it is, it's just a vocabulary question. So because of a vocabulary question, it is what? That's right, DOK1. So even though it might sound complex, we have to understand it has to do with how many steps your brain has to go through to actually solve that question. And if I just know that vocabulary word, then that you wax on, which is waxing, then because you know that vocabulary word, you'll actually be able to answer that question. You don't have to really go through any steps or process. Of course, build an app that allows students to connect with the teacher to help with homework. Well, think about how many processes would need that app, what the duration would be. Because those take a while, what DOK level do we think this would be? Of course, it would be a DOK4, because this is something where we take a real world example and help somebody out. Things that we want to think about as a performance task. So next week, when you look at your teacher pre and post test, and you're going to bring them, the thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at our DOK levels of questions. We're going to look at the questions. We're going to ask ourselves, what kind of thought process goes into each one of these questions? That's what we're going to do next week. And of course, we're going to also look at, are they selected response? Are they written response? That kind of thing. We want to make sure that we do that to understand. This has been our lesson. Thank you for filling this out. I appreciate it, and I can't wait to see you guys next week.